Alright, let's go ahead and begin our Week 7 lecture. This week we're going to go ahead and talk about the presidency. We're going to be talking about a lot of things today, but it should overall be a shorter lecture, particularly compared to the lengthy lecture I gave on Congress. First off, though, we have a few things to discuss. First off, discussion boards. Discussion boards have been a little weak on their responses. So I would definitely want you guys to elaborate a lot more, and I definitely want you guys to respond to one another and try to create a discussion about politics and the things that we're discussing every week. So, with that being said, just please try to post just a little bit more and be a lot more elaborate in your responses. The second thing is extra credit for this week. Extra credit for this week is about voter registration. I really care that you guys are active in politics, have an opinion on politics, and part of doing that is voting. Voting is a very important part of the overall political system. So remember that this week's extra credit is registered to vote. Just provide me with proof that you are registered to vote or are currently registered. And you can just do that by sending me a scan of your registration card or your registration application. And you can also send that through me through email, through Skype, or I also have my office hours. Feel free to show up here and just visit with me real quick and just show me that you've registered to vote. That being said, I understand that not everyone can register to vote, and several people have actually emailed me about this topic. So if you can't register to vote, that's completely fine. Just go ahead and in a Word document, just at least let me know that you're aware of the qualifications for voting. So list all the qualifications for voting in a Word document. You can easily do this with a Google search. You can just Google search Texas voter registration requirements or something like that. And tell me which one of these qualifications you do not meet, and tell me why. It may just be that you're too young or that you're not a citizen or something like that, but at least tell me why you cannot register to vote. That way I know that it's at least a somewhat invalid excuse, and I understand that. So that's your Week 7 extra credit. I would definitely encourage you to do that. It's worth 2 points, and I think as many of you saw on the last exam, that extra credit really can go a long ways into improving your grade, especially when you consider that there's about 30 or so more points of extra credit throughout the entire semester. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the lecture today. Like I said, we're going to talk about the presidency, and we really need to begin with the founding of our nation under the Articles of Confederation. And if you remember when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, the founders were really worried about establishing another king. They had just fought King George over the Revolutionary War. They had just won their independence, and so now that they needed to start developing a new government, they were really concerned about that king aspect, that almost tyrannical aspect to having an executive. So the founders were really concerned about having a king, but that being said, they also had, when they finally did away with the Articles of Confederation, they had concerns over the new established presidency. So remember, under the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have a king because they were really concerned about that. Then with the establishment of the Constitution, these founders really kind of came together and said, we really need we really need an executive, because everything was so kind of scattered in the Articles of Confederation. It didn't really work out because there was no executive to carry out the laws. So these are what the founders really wanted with the executive. You have Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton. These are the main three. Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and Hamilton was a highly prolific figure at that time. So first with Madison. Madison really wanted a carefully circumscribed executive that Congress could limit through checks and balances. So Madison saw the executive as necessary, and he really wanted it to be really well outlined what the executive can do. And then if the executive got too powerful, he wanted to have that Congress that could limit it through checks and balances. Now Jefferson was an anti-federalist. He was really skeptical about having this federal government to begin with. And that's why he thought that Congress and the president should be equals. And the president should be a strong party leader. So remember, Jefferson was very partisan. He really liked party politics. But that being said, he thought that Congress and the president should be equal. That they should be on equal terms, that the president should not be bigger than the Congress, and the Congress should not be bigger than the president. And that would allow the federal government just kind of to keep an even level head and not get too big. Hamilton was very excited about the idea of an executive. He loved the idea of a federal government, a strong central government, because Hamilton was pretty much the leader of the Federalist Party at that time, which supported strong national government. Hamilton wanted a vigorous and opportunistic executive, and that the government should revolve around the president. The president should be the most central figure to the federal government. Also for Hamilton, loyalty was very important. Like I said, he was pretty much the leader of the Federalist Party at that time, so loyalty to him and party politics were also important, but that party should favor a strong national government and a strong executive for that matter. Now, there were several leaders before Washington. Washington we often assign as our first president, and under this Constitution he really was. There were several leaders before Washington, though, under the Articles of Confederation, although they weren't designated as president. And if you remember, like I said, under the Articles of Confederation, they really didn't have many powers at all. So, we finally got through the Constitutional Convention, and we decided to go ahead and begin looking at, in Article 2, what to do about the president. Remember, the legislative branch was addressed in Article 1, now we're on to Article 2. In Article 2, Section 1 establishes the executive branch. It says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So this is the first time we talk about having a president, and with executive power. So what this Article 2, Section 1 does is it establishes a unitary executive with the power in one president, select based on popular representation in states as states. And when we get to the Electoral College, you'll see what I mean by states as states. Article 2, Section 1 outlines the qualifications for president, and then all presidents must meet these three qualifications here. They must be 35 years or older, so there's an age limit, although most people are not 35 years. They're a lot older. They're a lot more experienced in politics and tend to represent usually middle-aged demographic. They must have lived in the United States for the last 14 years, so they wanted someone to be that was familiar with the United States, that didn't have interest in foreign affairs and those sorts of things, or at least have a vested interest in another country. And then also must be a natural-born citizen, meaning they were born in the United States. Now, this is very interesting, particularly for the first 6 or so presidents, that they weren't born in the actual United States, they were born in the colonies. So that's always an interesting argument. And then also recently in 2008, the debate over a natural-born citizen was also re-highlighted when you had the Obama controversy, where there was concerns that he had spent time in Indonesia, he was born to a Kenyan father, so he could also be considered Kenyan. And so the Obama controversy was highly prevalent for a long time. Even after Obama was elected president, there were still a lot of people that were concerned that he wasn't a natural-born citizen, and that was sort of a section of society that really made that argument. But also in 2008, on the flip side of that, you also had John McCain, and John McCain was born on a military base outside of the United States. And so there was concern about he wasn't actually born in the United States, he was born just in a base that was run by the United States. So in 2008, this whole natural-born citizen controversy really took off with these two. And if you're interested more in the controversy itself, feel free to click on these two links. You can read about both of them. They're both really fascinating. And it was pretty much the first time in over 200 years that we really debated about the requirement of being a natural-born citizen. So that was very fascinating to me anyways, being a political scientist, I guess. But let's go ahead and talk about the election of the presidency, and this is where it's going to get really tricky, and there's going to be a lot of confusing sort of things that go on, because the Electoral College is very confusing in itself. It's often thought that we just elect the president based on the popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes wins. It really doesn't work out that way. The president is not directly elected, but is instead chosen by the Electoral College. This is laid out in Section 1, Clause 2. So Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. Immediately they wrote out how are we going to select this president. And I'll go ahead and just read this text to you. Feel free to skip forward in the lecture if you don't want to listen to me, just read it to you. But here's what it says in Section 1, Clause 2. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. So, let's go ahead and break that down just a little bit more on these next few slides here. The president must be selected by a majority of electors in a winner-take-all system. Now, remember, that's electors, not voters. Voters are not electors. Electors are members of the Electoral College. So, A candidate with the most vote takes all electors from that state. Each state has a certain number of electors, and we're going to get into that here in just a little bit. Each state has a certain amount of electors, and if the candidate wins that state, he takes the whole number of electors from that state. So what this means is that the president can win the Electoral College. He just needs to get enough Electoral College votes from each of the states. But he could lose the popular vote if let's say those states are very sparsely populated, they don't have a whole lot of population, or if he takes the states with the most electors and loses the popular vote overall. So the Electoral College allows for states to be key in selection. Remember, the federalism issue of how important are states under this new system was really highly prevalent at this time. And this was a way of giving states even more power over the federal government in a particular, maybe indirect way. So Electoral College votes are based on population. So each state has a certain amount of Electoral College votes, and it's based on how many people live in that state. Because remember, how many people live in that state determines how many House of Representative members you have. And House of Representative members are used in calculating the number of Electoral College votes they have. So each state gets one elector for every one U.S. House of Representative members. And they also get 2 electors for every 2 senators per state. So, that being said, every state has at least 1 U.S. House of Representatives member and 2 senators. So each state, no matter how big or small, is worth at least 3 votes. So you have certain states that are only worth 3 votes, and those tend to be really small states or states with no population. So, for example, Montana, Wyoming, Rhode Island, Vermont. All of these states are very small, don't have a whole lot of population, so they're only worth... they don't have a lot of population, or they're just small in geographical size, so they don't have a lot of U.S. House of Representative members, so they only get three Electoral College votes. On the flip side of that, you have states such as California and Texas. Texas has a huge population, and it's a big state to begin with. So they have 36 House of Representative members, so they get 36 electors for every House of Representative member, so they get 36 electors just from the House, plus their 2 senators. Texas is worth 38 overall Electoral College votes. California, 53 U.S. House of Representative members plus 2 senators, 55 Electoral College votes. Those are big states. Those are worth a lot in the Electoral College. So how many electors are there total? Well, there's 435 members in the House of Representatives, like we talked about last week, and then there's 100 senators, like we talked about last week as well. Plus you get D.C. D.C. is actually an unusual case. D.C. had to fight for its right to be important in the Electoral College vote. And they did. They won that case. So you have 3 additional electors for Washington, D.C. because they get the amount equal to the least of the states. They have a status of being a state, technically, that is equal, and they get equal Electoral College votes equal to the least amount of states. So they get 3. So 435 plus 100 plus 3 for DC equals 538. How many does it take to win? Well, you need to win at least half of those. And so 538 divided by 2 is 269. But you need to win more than half. Remember, you want a majority, not an equal half. You want a majority. So it's 270 to win. And you just figure that by 538 divided by 2, which is 269. Now remember, some people can just win the Electoral College vote. That's all it takes to win the presidency, but they could lose the popular vote. And this has happened a number of times. You have certain elections that have had trouble. You have the 1800 election, 1824 election, 1876 election, 1888 election, and then you went almost 112 years before you had the 2000 election and the 2000 election fiasco with George W. Bush and Al Gore. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Just a quick example, though, I put the 1888 election on here with Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harris. This is the 1876 election with Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harris, and you can see the Electoral College votes. Harrison wins the Electoral College votes over Cleveland, but however, Cleveland wins the popular vote. He had about 100,000 more Electoral College votes, which at that time, that's a significant portion of the population. Cleveland does get in even and win the 1892 election. So sorry, I guess it was the 1888 election. Just a little off on my timing there. But Cleveland does end up getting even and wins the 1892 election. So that being said, let's go ahead and delve into just a little bit more of the Electoral College and how the math works out, and then we're going to go ahead and talk about Bush versus Gore, which some of you may be old enough to remember that, some of you may not. I was in 5th grade at that time, and it was a huge news fiasco at the time. So let's go ahead and look at the Electoral College math, and maybe this graph will explain it just a little bit more, or at least a little bit better than this previous slide here. So this is just a theoretical example, a theoretical chart that you can use to maybe calculate the Electoral College. So let's say in this, you have a state, you have a country, just like the United States. However, there's only five countries, or 5 states, sorry. So you have 5 states, simply named A, B, C, D, and E. And they each have a different population, which is evenly dispersed based on region. You increase by 10,000. So state A has 10,000 all the way to state E, which has 50,000. And the total population, once you add all these up, is 150,000. So for each 10,000 in population, you get 1 U.S. House of Representatives member. And so state A has 10,000, so they get 1. State E has 50,000, so they get 5. Sounds easy. Plus, remember, there's equal representation in the Senate, so they each get 2 senators. So, based on your population plus your amount of senators, you get this amount of electors. So state A has 3, and state E has 7. So state E is worth a little bit more, but state E still has a little bit of a say. And this is just the simple ratios if you want to go ahead and calculate those out. So your total population, 150,000, plus your total number of electors is 25. Now, this could actually misfire in many ways. So this is how, let's say this is how the vote comes out. So this is actually kind of what happened in the 2000 election with Bush versus Gore. With Bush, this would be the popular vote. Remember, this is based on population. And remember, state E has a lot of population. State A, not so much. But state A votes 60,000 to 4,000 in favor of Gore, or in favor of Bush. State E, though, votes 40,000 to 10,000 in favor of Gore. So you add all these numbers up, and you can see quite clearly that because of this 40,000 and this large number here, plus this large disproportionate number here in State C, you get a number of 89,000 for Bush, but only 61,000 for Gore. But remember, unfortunately, the popular vote doesn't matter. What matters is Electoral College votes. And so Bush wins in State A, so he gets the 3 Electoral College votes there. Bush also wins in State B, so he gets the 4 Electoral College votes here. He misses on State C, but he does come back in State D and wins 25,000 to 15,000 in State D, so he gets the 6 right here. So Bush has done really well. He's won 3 states, even though he hasn't won the popular vote overall. He does win those 3 states. And when you add those 3 states together, you get 13. Now, let's look at Gore. Gore wins State C and he wins State E, which are worth 5 and 7, respectively. 5 plus 7 is only 12, which is less than 13. So Bush gets 13, and Gore only gets 12 Electoral College votes, so Bush wins the Electoral College 13 to 12. What matters in terms of who wins the presidency is this Electoral College vote. So Bush goes on and wins the presidency, despite the fact that he only got 41% of the popular vote. So therefore, he's going to go into office not having a popular mandate, and the fact that Gore beat him almost 60 to 40%, which looks really unpopular. Pun intended, I guess, there. So Bush wins the presidency, and this is what happened in 2000. In 2000, Bush loses the popular vote, but wins the Electoral College vote over Gore. And so Gore, these are the actual numbers. You had Gore that won 50 million, almost 51 million in the popular vote, and Bush won 50 million and a half, 50.5 million, we'll go ahead and just say that, in the popular vote. You did have some other candidates, such as Ralph Nader and some independent candidates, or third-party candidates, I guess I should say. But they didn't win any states. So in the Electoral College, Bush got the right amount of states, and he got 271 Electoral College votes. Gore got 266. So it was a close election overall. But regardless of that fact, it still kind of stands out that Bush did not win the popular vote, and Gore, but he did win the Electoral College vote. So that's how Bush became president. Is he lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College vote. If you want to go more into this case, like I said, it was a really high-profile case at the time. A lot of people were calling for reforms of the system, and many people still do. Many people still feel that the popular vote should count more. We haven't had a controversy like this since 2000, so it'll be interesting to see when the next one arises and see whether this will be another push for reform or not. But if you want to go ahead and delve more, I've provided these links right here. Feel free to click on the links in the slides. It's a really fascinating case. And if you weren't alive during this time or you weren't politically aware at the time, it's definitely worth reading up on. And if you were, feel free to share your stories about the Bush versus Gore election. It was a huge media fiasco at the time. So, I hope all this Electoral College stuff makes sense. It's a simple way, or it's not really a simple way. It is the way that we elect our presidents at this time. It gets kind of confusing, but if you can do the math, it actually really kind of plays out. It usually works out nicely. There's very few examples of the controversy. But let's go ahead and look at the Electoral College in terms of states. Now, a lot of politicians, when they're running for president, they want to focus in on these states. Because they're worth a lot of Electoral College votes, or it's often indeterminate whether they're going to be Democratic or Republican. So on the left-hand column here, I have the big states, the ones that are worth the most Electoral College votes. California is worth the most Electoral College votes because they have the largest population, and they're a bigger state in terms of geography. So they're worth 55. Second is our state, Texas. Texas is worth 38 Electoral College votes. Which means they have a large population, obviously a lot less than California because so many people have moved to California. But Texas has a sizable amount, and it's worth a lot. Unfortunately for California and Texas, though, they tend to vote a particular way. California tends to vote for Democrats, and Texas tends to vote for Republicans. So while they're big states, politicians don't necessarily visit those states because they're already set in their ways, sort of. We already kind of know beforehand how they're going to vote. So, but you do have swing state in Florida. Florida is a swing state, and it's a big state. So a lot of presidential candidates will campaign there because it's worth a lot in terms of overall Electoral College votes, but it's also unsure. They really need to battle there. They need to go toe-to-toe with their opponent in Florida to demonstrate that they're an electable candidate and to vote for their party. Other big state is New York and Pennsylvania. Those tend to also be blue states. But let's go ahead and look on the swing state side here. Once again, I've already kind of mentioned Florida. You have Ohio. Ohio is a huge swing state because Ohio flip-flops so much between voting Republican and voting Democrat. And Ohio has actually predicted the winner of the Electoral College in the last several elections. As Ohio goes, so goes the nation is often the common saying there. So Ohio is worth 18 too, which is not a bad number. It's worth quite a bit. You have Virginia. It's a swing state. It's worth. Sorry, I just saw a spider on my wall and I'm kind of freaking out. But I will let it be and hopefully it doesn't get me. All right. Anyways, my apologies. Virginia's worth 13 Electoral College votes, so it's worth quite a bit, but it also flip-flops a lot, so a lot of politicians will campaign in Virginia. And North Carolina is typically red, but it did recently switch blue for Obama, so we'll see how North Carolina whether it becomes a key swing state in future elections or not. Now, for purposes of your discussion board question, and also just for your personal entertainment, I provided this link here on theoreticals. If this was an in-person class, we'd actually play around with this a lot more. The theoretical map is really fun. You can switch to certain states to vote Republican or certain states to vote blue or Democrat. When I say blue, I mean Democrat. When I say red, I mean Republican. And you can switch the states to vote either Democrat or Republican, and you can kind of see how the Electoral College numbers shift around and what that means for each of the parties. So, but for your discussion board questions, you will need to click on this link and visit this theoretical Electoral College map website. It's a lot of fun to play with, especially if you're a political nerd like I am. But that being said, you will need it for your discussion board questions. So, all right. So I hope all the Electoral College stuff made sense. If you have any questions, please send them my way. I will try to explain the Electoral College vote the best I can. If not, there's a lot of YouTube videos out there on it as well. So there's a lot of resources for you if you're not quite sure exactly how it pans out right now. So let's go ahead and talk about the presidency itself. Presidential oath. So you fight the election battle. You win enough Electoral College votes to win the presidency. And then you go ahead and you're now focused on your presidential oath. And the presidential oath happens at the inauguration ceremony. It's usually a big media event. A lot of people watch it. And it was originally done on March 4th because travel time took a lot more. Travel time took a lot longer back in the day. On the 20th Amendment, though, things were speeding up. There was now trains. People could move a lot quicker. And so the 20th Amendment changed this to January 20th. So January 20th, every 4 years, 2013, 2017 will be the next one, you have this huge inauguration event. You administer the oath of office, and it's administered by the Chief Justice. It's the quote is exactly right here. I won't go ahead and read it out to you, but if you want to go ahead and pause the video and read it, it's usually a huge televised event. You can find YouTube videos of every president taking this oath, pretty much. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about the perks and benefits of being president. There's a lot of perks and benefits, quite honestly. You have your very nice salary. I'm not gonna lie, it's actually a pretty nice salary. It's $400,000 a year. And that's just your salary. You get extra expenses as well. You get a $50,000 expense account. You get $100,000 for travel. There's also a $19,000 entertainment fund, which I always found funny because Netflix is like $8 a month. So I wonder if Netflix is in that entertainment fund. But I'm sure a lot of that's for like plays and hosting musicians and stuff in the White House. You get certain privileges as well. You got your Air Force One, which is the big jumbo jet, which you often see on television. And you also get Marine One, which is the helicopter. You often see the president walking across the White House lawn and getting into the helicopter. That is Marine One, the helicopter. You also get your presidential motorcade, which is very nice, and it's always a big deal. They often close down roads to allow the presidential motorcade to pass by. In terms of benefits, though, you get a pretty nice retirement pension. You get $191,000. You get your Secret Service detail. And you also get Secret Service detail not only for you, but also for your immediate family members. And you get that for 10 years after your presidency. So 10 years after your presidency ends, you no longer get Secret Service detail. And that started with George W. Bush. So Clinton and H.W. Bush and Carter, the living presidents, they have their Secret Service detail for life. Starting with George W. Bush and also Barack Obama, they only have their Secret Service detail 10 years afterwards. Often, you also get a presidential library as well. A lot of presidents have presidential libraries. George W. Bush's just opened, I believe, within the past year. His presidential library is located in Dallas. That's where he wanted his presidential library to be. I believe also, in terms of Texas, there is the Johnson Presidential Library, the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, as well as the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. So, a lot of cool history with presidents here in Texas, for sure. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about the constitutional basis of the presidency, though. And one of the big things is not only did we need to lay out how to elect presidents and what their salary was and things like that, they were really concerned about developing a new king and a new tyrant. They also wrote in the Constitution how to remove the president. And if this were an in-person class, we'd actually spend quite a bit of time on removal of the presidency. We talk about Andrew Johnson. He was impeached but not removed. We would talk about Nixon, who was going to be impeached but went ahead and resigned. And then we would usually talk about Clinton, who was impeached but not removed. So the constitutional basis for removing a president is laid out in Article 1, Sections 2 and 3. And the reason why they put it in Article 1, remember Article 1 deals with Congress, is because Congress is the one that has the power to impeach and remove. Now I want you to recognize the difference between impeachment and removal or conviction, because there is a difference, and I can guarantee it'll be on your test. Impeachment is a decision by the U.S. House to then order the Senate to have a trial, and if he's found guilty in that trial, then he is removed. So impeachment does not mean removal. It simply means a decision to vote articles of impeachment, which is indictment. So the House votes by a simple majority to impeach. Then it goes to the Senate, which then has to convict the president by 2/3. So getting an impeachment is quite easy, quite honestly. To only have a majority disagree with the president so much that they would be willing to impeach him, that makes sense. The actual removal part is much harder. Getting the Senate, which remember is much more collegial and friendly, to get them to actually convict the president by 2/3 would be very, very difficult. That's why we've actually never had a president removed from office. So House will vote for impeachment, and then the Senate will have the trial and possibly a conviction. Now, when the Senate has the trial, the Chief Justice presides over the presidential president's trials, and that's because remember the checks and balances. The Senate is basically operating a court decision, and so the Chief Justice needs to be present so that all branches are in tune, and that the offense has to be serious enough to actually warrant a removal from the presidency. Now, let's say he were convicted. This would remove the president from office, and it would take away his pension. Once again, this has never happened, though, so we don't really know how that would play out. In Article 2, Section 4, allows for removal of a president from office for treason, bribery, and other high crimes such as felonies, and then possible misdemeanors as well. I would say that the only one that's actually the one that has come the closest to actually being removed from office is Andrew Johnson. He was almost removed from office, and he missed conviction by 1 vote. That's the closest we've ever been to removing a president. However, still has yet to happen, and I doubt it'll happen for any time soon. It'd have to be a pretty serious offense at this point. So, if you have any questions about impeachment versus removal, I hope I explained it enough there. Just remember that the House impeaches and the Senate actually holds the trial and removes. The House only requires a majority, and the Senate requires 2/3. So if you have any questions, please send them my way, and I'll try to explain it a little bit better than I did right there. And like I said, if this was an in-person class, we'd probably spend a lot more time talking about the actual cases of Johnson, Nixon, and Clinton. So let's say he was removed, or, as is most common here, the case of death. Certain presidents have died within office, whether by assassination or just natural death. So upon removal or death, the vice president becomes the president. Now, let's say there's a vacancy in the VP position. The president is responsible for nominating a person to fill the position. And this requires majority approval in both the House of Reps and the Senate as well. So VP becomes president if the presidency is vacant. We've never gone beyond the vice president, fortunately. We've never had both a death of the president and the vice president at the same time. They often travel on different planes and are in different locations pretty much at all times. But if there were to be a vacancy in the president and the vice president, you would see this complete list of succession come into play. Now, it's never happened, so I won't go ahead and click on the link, but if you do want to click on the link, you want to know more about the entire list of succession, feel free to go ahead and look at that. The Speaker of the House is actually 3rd in line, and then President Pro Tempore of the Senate is 4th in line, and then after that it goes into the different departments of the executive branch. So, fortunately, we've never had to go that far. Now let's go ahead and talk about the theories of the presidency. Now there are different ways to approach the presidency. And when I talk about the presidency, I mean like the actual institution of the president. How should the institution of the president be portrayed, and what are its duties? And it's really evolved over time. Now we had this idea of strict constructionist. The strict constructionist theory actually really prevailed in the presidency through Washington, through McKinley. So almost over 100 years, we abided by the strict constructionist. And how the strict constructionist would view the presidency is he would say that the presidency should be limited in power to those granted by the Constitution and Congress. Only if it's in the Constitution and only if it's granted by Congress. Those are the only powers that the president should have, and that's it. And so a lot of people, when they criticize the president now, or in modern times, I guess I should say, it's because they often have a strict constructionist view of the presidency, and they say that the president has violated the Constitution. Our founding fathers would be appalled. Those sorts of things. That's the strict constructionist sort of view, is that the president should be limited in power overall, and it should be limited to only those powers that are in the Constitution or granted by Congress. However, as the president became more powerful, and he really has evolved the presidency really has evolved into a powerful institution, we began to see new views on how the presidency should operate. And the other one, the one that really evolved later on after the strict constructionist, is the stewardship theory. And Teddy Roosevelt was really the kind of father of this view. And he said, or he thought that the presidency should be able to exercise whatever powers are not illegal. So as long as it's not illegal, meaning that it doesn't violate a huge law, the president should be able to do that. And Teddy Roosevelt was a very, very powerful president, one of the most powerful presidents up to his time. But then we had national emergencies, and we had the Great Depression, and so then the theories of the presidency began to change into this prerogative theory. People began to view the presidency in terms of having whatever powers are necessary to protect the nation. The president should have a vested interest in the nation and do what is necessary to keep the standards of the nation alive, or to keep the nation in progress and turning, and that sort of thing. So the final theory would be the prerogative theory, just doing whatever powers are necessary to protect the nation. And FDR was really the founding father of this, because he needed to exercise presidential power to keep the economy afloat. And also, he needed to respond to an external threat after Pearl Harbor and the rise of World War II. So that's why FDR is thought of the prerogative theory, and really the prerogative theory has guided the presidency since the time of FDR, and even into today. We're still exercising this prerogative theory because presidents are now exercising whatever powers are necessary to protect the nation, and it's really continued. Every president has almost had a need to protect the nation in some sort of sense, whether that be from the threat of communism in the Cold War, Vietnam during the Vietnam War, Russia during the Cold War, and then you had the 9/11 attacks, and we've needed to respond to those. So threats to security have really secured the prerogative theory, pun intended there. So that's where we get with our modern presidency now. Now, the first one to talk about the modern presidency, though, was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, in his book, Congressional Government, suggests that the Constitution makes the president kind of chief clerk, meaning that he oversees all these branches and he keeps the accounts in order and those sorts of things. History has also shown that the president can wield much power. Lincoln was one of the most powerful presidents of his time because he did what was necessary to preserve the Union. That meant going to war. That meant suspending the writ of habeas corpus and those sorts of things. Lincoln was a really powerful president also. However, the president most responsible for the modern presidency is, as I said, FDR. He served 4 terms from 33 to 45, which is the longest time anyone has ever served as president. And he was trying to bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression, and he was leading it through World War II. So he was a powerful president. He had all these powers at his disposal, and often, even despite some opposition, he was able to exercise those powers and expand the powers of the presidency. FDR was in many ways thought to be an imperial president, just a strong president who wields substantial power. And like I said, the 2 important factors that led to FDR's power were the national emergency with the Great Depression, and he had a lot of popularity as well. He won 4 terms to the presidency. And many people thought the way that he was responding to these national emergencies was appropriate and needed. So we needed solidarity at that time. And FDR was someone that a lot of people rallied behind at that time. So that's how strong the presidency became under him, and it has continued since then. In terms of national security, in terms of economic powers as well. They often promote tax plans, they promote economic policies as well. So presidents are really, really powerful. Now, that being said, even though they're powerful, we need to go ahead and distinguish what is between express powers, delegated powers, and implied powers. Express powers are those that are actually expressly written in the Constitution. And under a strict constructionist view, they would actually view the presidency as only having the powers that are expressed. If you were a strict constructionist, remember those are the people that only believe that the president should yield power provided by the Congress or the Constitution. So express powers are those provided in the Constitution, and this is what sections 2 and 3 outline for the presidency. It says that the president can participate in legislative processes. That makes sense. That's part of the checks and balances system of having a dialogue with Congress. The president also has the power to appoint, remove, and supervise all executive officers. Remember, the president is the head of the executive branch, so he has to appoint, remove, and supervise all executive officers. We'll go ahead and talk about executive officers a lot more when we talk about the bureaucracy and things like that. That being said, also part of the checks and balances system He has the power to appoint, remove, and supervise all judicial officers as well. Any federal judicial officers, he has the power to oversee those. That's part of the system of checks and balances. The president is also commander-in-chief of national military and the National Guard, and he also acts as a head of state. He's also really involved in foreign affairs. Now, that was the strict constructionist view. There's also such things as delegated powers, and that also tends to go with the strict constructionist view. But it also goes with other theories as well. And those delegated powers are just those that are granted by Congress through certain acts. If Congress has given the presidency that power, then it's a delegated power. And it's not found in the Constitution, it's just found in an act or law therein. So, there's also inherent powers, though. And inherent powers go a lot more with the prerogative theory rather than the stewardship or the strict constructionist view. And this is just, inherent powers are just part of presidential responsibilities. Now, how big are those presidential responsibilities? That kind of depends. But that being said, they are part of the presidential responsibilities. They're also not expressed in the Constitution, but believed to be inferred from, quote, the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency. So as long as it fits within the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency, then it's okay, and it's just an inherent power. It's nothing that we need to write out expressly. And that kind of gets some presidents in hot water because they can say it's part of the inherent powers, but once again, it's not written into anything, so it could be kind of a ambiguous sort of thing. Now, focusing into the president as a head of state and as a foreign diplomat and those sorts of things, let's go ahead and talk about treaties versus executive agreements. Treaties are an important part of the role of the president as head of state. To be a head of state, to be also a commander-in-chief, to be a prominent foreign diplomat, or at least the face of the nation, sort of, treaties are a part of that, and also executive agreements are as well. Now, treaties are written in the Constitution. Treaties require Senate approval by 2/3 vote. Now, treaties require a 2/3 vote, and getting the Senate to agree on anything by 2/3 is very, very difficult. So what the presidents often opt for instead are executive agreements. Executive agreements have the same status as law, but do not require any vote by the House or Senate to go into effect. Now, overall, executive agreements have made up 90% of all international agreements. And this is for a number of reasons. One, the fact that treaties require a Senate approval by 2/3. That's very, very difficult to get that 2/3 approval. Also, it's the fact that our economy and the way we interact with other states has become highly globalized, and so we're having a lot more interactions with other states. And to make them all treaties and to get all of that passed through Congress would be very, very difficult. So executive agreements are just a result of needing to deal with problems a lot quicker than usual. So you can kind of see that in 1789 to 1829, we had 60 treaties and only 27 executive agreements. We weren't really dealing with a lot of foreign nations at that time, and also we had an isolationist view of foreign affairs. We didn't want to talk to other countries at all. Well, at least only those that were close to us. And so that was all we really did. And so we had 60 treaties, 27 executive agreements. Now, flip forward almost 200 years, and you can see how internationalized the nature of politics has become. We've had 850 plus treaties, quite a few, definitely a lot more than we used to have. But that being said, we've had 14,000 executive agreements. So we've talked to a lot more countries, we've done a lot more things, and we've needed to do them more quickly, and rather than being kind of stuck with that 2/3 vote in the Senate, that sort of thing. So I want you to know the difference between treaties versus executive agreements. Just know that treaties require the 2/3 vote from the Senate, and executive agreements don't require any vote by the House or the Senate. It just simply goes into effect because it needs to be done and handled quickly. So now those are treaties versus executive agreements, and those tend to deal with foreign affairs. Now there's such things as congressional executive agreements, and there's also sole executive agreements. Congressional executive agreement is submitted for a simple congressional vote. So sometimes these executive agreements do go through Congress, even though they don't require any vote by the House or Senate to go into effect. There are certain congressional votes that do happen on executive agreements. And they're used typically when appropriations are sought. So when they need money, when the president needs money, because remember, all revenue bills go through Congress. Remember, we talked about that last week. All revenue bills go through Congress. So anytime you're seeking, anytime you're seeking appropriations, there tends to be a congressional executive agreement. The example I have here is the agreement establishing that the U.S. is a part of an international organization, the International Monetary Fund. So that would be an example of a congressional executive agreement. Now let's say it has nothing to do with appropriations. It's just something that needs to be done. That would be a sole executive agreement, and that's between the president and a foreign state. And the example I provide here is Dames and Moore versus Reagan. This is quite an old example, and a little bit of U.S. history right here. This happened in 1981 during the Iran hostage crisis. You had President Carter at the time. President Carter, he made agreements during his time as president. This was in 1981. The case was in 1981. This actually happened during the Carter administration, because remember, it takes a while for court cases to get through the Supreme Court. But during Carter's time as president, during the Iran hostage crisis, which was in the late 70s, Carter made agreements to terminate legal proceedings against Iran and created an independent claims tribunal. So he wanted to terminate relationships with Iran based on financial agreements and also just legal arrangements as well. Now you had the private firm Dames and Moore had attempted to recover the $3 million owed to them by the Shah of Iran, and the Shah of Iran's government and Dames and Moore claimed the president did not have the authority to terminate the legal proceedings in U.S. courts. So remember, we're cutting off all ties with Iran at this time. And so Carter cuts off these ties with Iran. This claim hasn't been settled yet for $3 million. And the Supreme Court weighs in Dames and Moore versus Reagan. Did the president have the authority to transfer Iranian funds to nullify illegal claims against Iran? And yes, he did. Because this pretty much established the constitutionality of this sole executive agreement. The president can make sole executive agreements with a foreign state, even if it is a matter of money, and you can shut down relations through executive agreements with other nations. So I know I did a really bad job of explaining that. If you have any questions about that, just let me know. Just know the difference between sole executive agreements versus congressional executive agreements. And if you are actually interested in the Iran hostage crisis and Dames and Moore versus Reagan, feel free to click on the link here and read a little bit more. So hopefully I explained that well enough, though, and you can kind of get the gist of it. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about executive orders. Executive orders are a little bit different. Executive orders, instead of dealing with foreign affairs, executive orders deal with domestic affairs. Domestic orders which do not require the president to have congressional approval. And this is most commonly used to help implement legislation that Congress has already passed. Now, sometimes it does happen in the absence of congressional legislation. Most recently, you've had President Obama. He issued an executive order to deal with illegal immigration, and Congress was up in arms. The Republican majority in Congress, I guess I should say, was up in arms because they thought that what Obama was doing surpassed or usurped what Congress was supposed to do. And in many ways, it sort of did. But that being said, executive orders still do have the same status as law. Congress can pass a new law or refuse to fund the order, but they don't have to. And the executive order can go into effect. So executive orders have the same status as law, and they tend to deal with a domestic issue. You can think of other famous executive orders, such as the enforcement of desegregation in public schools. Executive orders were issued to try to implement that legislation. So Congress can pass a new law or refuse to fund the executive order. Examples would be the closing of Guantanamo Bay, when Obama wanted to close down Guantanamo Bay. However, Congress refused to fund that order. And also, there was a controversy with the abortion funding for international organizations. There was a concern that certain international organizations that the United States belongs to supported abortion funding. And so Congress passed a new law that said we're not going to fund any international organizations that also fund abortions. So executive orders can kind of get presidents in hot water sometime because they are orders from the president, and they usually go through without, even if it goes against Congress's approval. So, executive orders are domestic, executive agreements are international. I want you to know that difference for your test. Now, let's go ahead and look at executive orders by the numbers. This is just the number of significant executive orders. Now, this isn't the total number of executive orders, but it is the number of significant executive orders. And you can see down here, starting almost 100 years ago, there was no executive orders, no significant executive orders anyways. But you get through here and you get into the FDR years here, and you can see how the number of significant executive orders spiked rapidly. The FDR at that time was wielding his power as president to get things through, get things done in terms of the New Deal and also in terms of World War II. He was a very powerful president, so the number of executive orders really, really went up. It tapers off a little bit, and it definitely tapers off during the Eisenhower years. Eisenhower didn't have to issue a lot of executive orders. He didn't have a whole lot going on. But you flip this and you get into the Kennedy and Johnson years. This is where you get into the civil rights movement and things like that right here. So executive orders are necessary. Continues on through the Carter years and the Reagan administration. It's really high up here, numbers of significant executive orders. You had the Iran hostage crisis. You also had a recession at that time and things like that. So number of significant executive orders went up. I would definitely say this chart comes down at 1995, but I would definitely say it's kind of decreased a little bit, but I would almost guess during the George Bush eras it also increased because of a need to respond to terrorism and homeland security. During Obama, though, it's kind of decreased, and you're going to see that on this next chart here. This is the history of executive orders, all the way go back to George Washington and then into modern times. So here you can see that the executive orders really actually increased, or at least this is the number of executive orders issued per day in office. It increased around the 1930s when the presidency was gaining more power. And you can see on this graph that easily FDR is the most powerful president, or at least he exercised the most powers as president, issuing almost one executive order per day that he was in office. Now it's tapered off down here, and you can see right here that Barack Obama, our current president, has actually issued one of the slowest rates of issuing executive orders. And I know you probably can't read the text here, but it says at his current rate of 0.09 executive orders per day in office, Obama is issuing orders at the slowest rate since Grover Cleveland. And that's for Barack Obama, but also you can see that George Bush didn't issue a lot per day, and neither did Clinton or the Bush before him. So executive orders really took off in the 30s when we were establishing a really strong presidency and we needed to respond to a number of things, but it's tapered off in modern times. That being said, they are issuing executive orders when they deem necessary. They're not issuing executive orders for everything that needs to be done like these presidents were here in the middle. So that just kind of gives you a kind of a history of executive orders. This graph kind of contradicts what's in this graph going back one slide. But remember, this is just significant executive orders, not all executive orders. This is all executive orders. So you kind of get a sense of how presidents are using the executive order. You're issuing it only when necessary. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about executive orders versus executive agreements versus treaties, let me know. I can guarantee that will all be on your test. So hopefully you guys have a strong sense of the definitions of each. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the military a little bit. One of the roles of the presidency is that he is commander-in-chief of the military. And as commander-in-chief, he has a lot of responsibility. He can commit troops abroad. He can also talk to Congress about committing troops abroad and committing them into a war situation. Now, even though he's commander-in-chief and he oversees the military, constitutionally speaking, Congress, both chambers of Congress, can declare war. Now, that being said, even though Congress is supposed to be the only one to declare war, formal declarations of war have only been done 5 times in U.S. history. Now, when you think about that, the U.S. is usually consistently at war, but we've only formally declared war 5 times. So that means the president has actually committed troops a lot more times than Congress has declared war. The president has committed troops over 400 times since World War II. 400 times, but we've only declared war 5 times. So, done by a joint resolution of Congress, funding for deployment of troops come from Congress. So when the president commits troops, he exercises this joint resolution by Congress and has the funding for deployment of troops from Congress. Also, as commander-in-chief, he's responsible for negotiating treaties. We kind of talked about that a little bit, how treaties need 2/3 Senate approval. But let's go ahead and talk about this committing troops 400 times versus declaring war only 5 times. And the reason why is probably because of this joint resolution of Congress and the War Powers Resolution Act. And this started with Nixon. Congress tries to limit the president's power to commit troops. He's committing troops at a rapid rate at this time, and Congress really tries to have some sort of checks and balances to limit his ability to declare war. So Nixon usurped power by engaging in secret bombings and diverting funds during the Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam conflict lasted for almost 10 years, and the president was pretty much in charge of the military that entire time. Congress responds by passing the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973. And this is the one I really care that you know because it's a huge, huge deal. Nixon vetoed this, but Congress overrides it by a 2/3 vote, one of the few times that Congress has overridden a president's veto. And Congress successfully overrides Nixon's veto, and actually, so now the War Powers Resolution Act comes into effect. This is what the War Power Resolution Act requires of a president in order to commit troops. The president can commit troops anywhere he wants to, but he must report to Congress within 48 hours after committing armed forces to combat. So the president commits armed forces to combat, he has to report that to Congress. Combat itself must end within 60 days unless specifically authorized by Congress to continue. So combat can continue for 60 days. After the 60 days, Congress has the deciding vote whether or not to bring those troops home or to continue funding them. Now that's where it gets a little bit sticky. Congress is the one that can bring the troops home. However, they don't want to seem like they're not supporting the troops. So usually what happens is that Congress goes ahead and funds it anyways and authorizes them to continue fighting there. Now this is what's happened in Iraq. President Bush at the time exercised the War Powers Resolution Act. He committed troops to Iraq. He gave Congress the 48-hour limit notice, and after the 60 days was over, Congress didn't want to seem like they weren't supporting the troops, so they authorized combat to continue, and they have continued to authorize combat to continue in Iraq until it's necessary, or until they bring the troops home. That being said, combat is winding down in Iraq, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see if we commit more troops eventually to deal with ISIS and what's going on over in Iraq. Now, there is a 30-day extension allowed to the president for troop withdrawal. Let's say Congress didn't authorize the troops to stay there. There is a 30-day extension allowed to the president for troop withdrawal. Congress can call troops home immediately if Congress passes a concurrent resolution, but like I said, they won't do that because they don't want to seem like they're not supporting the troops or supporting the security of the United States. Every single president, even though the president has the freedom to commit troops, every single president has said the act interferes with executive's authority, and that's why Nixon vetoed it to begin with. He thought this was an impediment on executive authority. Many presidents think that their power as commander-in-chief lets them commit troops wherever they want to, and a lot of people have that mindset towards this. And the War Powers Resolution Act actually sorts of limits that, but in practice, I don't believe that it really does. You can form your own opinion on that, and you are certainly feel free to do so. I believe there is an extra credit on it, or I'm not sure if I put it on your guys' syllabus, but I'll have to check on that. That being said, that's the War Powers Resolution Act. I hope that makes enough sense. It will be on your test about which Resolution Act tried to limit presidential power to control the military. It'll be the War Powers Resolution Act. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, please send them my way. Now, military is not only a foreign affairs either. There is domestic sources of military power as well. The presidential military power extends to the domestic arena, and this is in Article 4, Section 4. It provides for national government's protection of the states against invasion and domestic violence. So typically states request presidential and federal help. However, there are often many times that the federal government or the presidency, the executive branch, delves into the private affairs of states and citizens. And this is where we talk about the U.S. Patriot Act. The U.S. Patriot Act stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. USA Patriot. That's what that stands for. And the Patriot Act was a response to the 9/11 attacks and to the need for domestic security. So the U.S. Patriot Act, I've provided the link right there if you want to read that, and I please, I encourage you to do so because it explains a lot about what the Patriot Act is. The U.S. Patriot Act was ruled constitutional because of this Article 4, Section 4, because it provides against invasion and domestic violence. USA Patriot Act is a counterterrorism measure to protect against invasion and domestic violence, and it allows for the federal government to conduct surveillance. And what I mean by that is wiretaps on your phone, your data records, your social media accounts, and things like that. You as a private citizen could be labeled as a terrorist and put onto the list of subjects into the U.S. and under the USA Patriot Act. It's a huge debate about privacy as a citizen. Remember, privacy and protection from illegal search and seizure is guaranteed by the Constitution in Amendment 4. But with the passing of USA Patriot Act, also ruled constitutional, the U.S. government can conduct a mass amount of surveillance on your private accounts and possibly seize your information or your data as well. So there's this huge debate about USA Patriot Act, and if you want to write about the USA Patriot Act for your essay, I would definitely. It's a great topic to consider about the Constitution, what you would like to change about the Constitution. So keep that in mind when you write your papers. Also, remember that your papers are due in 2 weeks. I was supposed to remind you about that at the beginning of the lecture, so now I am. So remember that your papers are due in 2 weeks. In terms of the USA Patriot Act, though, in 2011, the Patriot Act Sunsets Extension Act was passed, so the Patriot Act is still law today. It extended some of the Patriot Act's key provisions, like roving wiretaps and surveillance of what they call lone wolves, through June of 2015. So it expires in June of 2015, so we'll see if it's extended, but that being said, it's still in effect today, and it still affects everyone who uses the internet, who uses data. Pretty much if you're on the grid, the USA Patriot Act definitely affects you, and so it's something to read up on it and be aware of when you're browsing the internet or when you're using your cell phones or things like that. So keep that in mind. Now, the president also has certain legislative power. Beyond his military power, he also has certain legislative power, and this is in Article 1, Section 7, and also Article 2, Section 3. The president's legislative powers just include the State of the Union. The State of the Union happens every year. It's a big media event. It just most recently happened in January. And it's just an address to Congress. And from Jefferson to Wilson, the message was just delivered in writing. Now it's a big speech. He addresses the Congress. He delivers the State of the Union. He outlines what he wants Congress to do in the next year, and he also outlines his own agenda as well. The president also has the veto power. We're going to go ahead and talk about that here in just a little bit. He has legislative initiative. He can draft his own bills, submit them to Congress, and hopefully they can get through. The president also engages in rulemaking, and he also engages in executive orders and agreements, which have the status of law, that's why it's also considered a legislative power. So let's go ahead and talk about the veto. The veto can happen in a number of ways, and I kind of talked about it a little bit about it last week, but it's going to be good to rehash this, especially for your test, because I can guarantee there's going to be a lot of questions about vetoes on your test. So, typically, if the president fails to sign a bill within 10 days, remember Sundays do not count, of the bill being presented to him, then the bill becomes a law even without his signature. So the bill sits on his desk, he doesn't sign it within 10 days, boom, it's a law. However, there are times where he's going to disagree with that bill. And this would be the executive veto. The executive veto is the most common veto. He just outright says veto. And that bill doesn't become law. It's sent back to Congress if Congress thinks it can override it. Congress must override the executive veto by 2/3 of a vote. Now, that being said, you can see by this chart down below that vetoes don't really happen anymore. This executive veto, even though it's the most common type of veto, it doesn't really happen anymore. Instead, what is happening now with the modern presidency is simply the threat of a veto. The threat of a veto is strategic, and rarely can Congress override it. So, In the history of the United States, there's been over 2,500 or more vetoes, and only 100 or so have been overridden. Only 100 or so times has Congress actually overridden a veto. So what the presidency has started doing is looking at that and saying, Congress can't override our veto. Why don't we just threaten them with a veto instead of actually doing it? And you can see here, these are the numbers. So FDR, he actually vetoed a lot. He didn't threaten to veto at all. He actually vetoed. Congress would pass stuff and he would just say, no, this isn't going to work. I'm going to veto it. But starting with JFK and kind of going down through the years, you can see that the threat of the veto is a lot more. JFK threatened to veto 21 times, or he only had to veto 21 times because instead he threatened to veto. Ford vetoed 66 times, but that being said, it's still a lot less than the 635 vetoes of FDR. Now getting into Clinton, Bush, Obama, our last three presidents, you can see once again the threat of the veto. All three of these were presidents for 2 terms. All three of these were 2-term presidents, and they only had to veto 22 times, 12 times, and 3 times respectively. Obama's only had to do it 3 times because instead of actually vetoing, he just threatens to veto, and then Congress doesn't pass the bill at all. So it's kind of stopping the problem before it arises in many ways. But that being said, it also kind of reflects poorly on Congress that they're not passing anything, or at least not trying to pass anything because of that threat of the veto. Now going on to the veto, if Congress has adjourned before that 10-day period is up, then the president can just pocket veto. Remember, it's all about that legislative time frame and the 10 days versus the not 10 days in session. If you have any questions about that, refer to our last lecture. In terms of the president, though, there's a lot of other issues that we need to talk about, but we didn't really get time to. And these are just a few of them. Public approval. That's a highly important public issue for the president is his public approval ratings. And you can go online, you can just type in presidential approval ratings, and you can find a number of polls that reflect his presidential approval, the president's approval rating. Press relations. Press relations are really, really important for presidents. They need to have good relations with the media. All of them have a press secretary to put a positive spin on everything that the president is doing. But the way that the president is portrayed in the media is very, very important, all the way from Fox News to MSNBC, from extreme right to extreme left. The way that he's represented in the press and his relationship with the press is very, very important. Issue timeliness. Issue timeliness is huge for presidents achieving their goals. Issues arise. Some issues are consistently there. Some issues are new. Some issues have been consistently there, but only peak during particular times. You can think about gun regulation and the Sandy Hook incident, how that rose up in 2012, and everyone was talking about that issue. But you can also talk about newer issues, such as LGBT rights. That's a relatively new issue on the agenda. So issue timeliness is also really important. And then diplomatic relations, particularly for me as an international relations scholar, diplomatic relations are very important because the way that the U.S. relates to other countries is very important, particularly in the way that the president is portrayed in other countries, and because as head of state he has a lot of say of what goes on in foreign affairs. So those are just some other presidential issues. If this was an in-person class, we'd definitely talk about each of these just a little bit longer. But let's go ahead and get to your discussion board questions for this week. And you have 2 of them technically. However, one of them has 3 parts here. So the first one here, I just want you to talk about the president, our current president. I want you to visit President Obama's website. I provided the link right here. It's whitehouse.gov. If you don't want to click on the link, whitehouse.gov. And follow the issues link. There's an issues link. It'll just say issues, and it'll be up on the top of the page. And I want you to find an issue President Obama speaks about on this site and give your opinion. Give your opinion. I don't care what, like I've said this before, I don't care what your opinion is. Just don't be, on the far, far left. Don't be on the far, far right. I want you to have an opinion. I want you to formulate an opinion about this particular issue. And then answer these questions. Do you agree with Barack Obama's stance on the topic of your choice? Why or why not? Remember, you're going to write a paper towards the end of the semester that deals with an issue that you care about, and you're going to give your opinion on that. So you could consider this issue when writing your final essay for this class. It can be anything. There's a number of issues that are talked about on this website. Everything from environmental policy into education, tax policy, foreign affairs, anything really. Any issue that you care about, just find it on this website, read President Obama's stance on it, and then give your own opinion on it as well. Also, remember with discussion boards, feel free to respond to each other's answers. And I do give out extra credit if you do respond to answers. So feel free to do that. Start a discussion, give your opinions. Be reasonable though, be civil. No, let's just refrain from the name calling. That's all I'm going to say. But have a reasoned, informed opinion. I don't care if it's conservative, liberal, libertarian, or populist. Either way, I just care that you are engaged in politics and having an opinion. That being said, second of all, the second part of this is kind of a prompt a little bit. Recently, many pundits and many political pundits are predicting this, have predicted that Texas could be a swing state in less than a decade because of the growing demographics moving into Texas. So I want you to visit the Theoretical Electoral College map. It's the link that I provided on that slide a long time ago, but it's also right here. Visit the Theoretical Electoral College map website and answer the following questions. And I want you to answer the questions in terms of who wins and the total number of Electoral College votes. So give me some numbers in your answers. I want you to play with the map, and I want you to turn Texas blue. What are the implications for the Electoral College if Texas turns blue? So who wins and what are the total numbers if Texas turns blue with the 2012 results? How would the Republicans fare in this scenario, and how would the Democrats fare in this scenario? I also want you to go ahead and take that list of swing states I provided you a long time ago, and I want you to turn all of them red, and I want you to turn all of them blue, and tell me who wins in what scenario and who loses in what scenario, and what are the total numbers of the swing states if all of them vote blue or if all of them vote red. And also, if you guys really should elaborate on your answers a little bit more. Tell me what you think about that, and tell me if you think it's plausible for that to happen and those sorts of things. So be expansive in your answers. Recently, your discussion boards have been really short and not very well thought out, which is what they're supposed to be overall. So be sure to do that in the discussion board questions, and you guys will definitely receive some extra credit and things like that for that. So that's the end of the lecture today. I hope I explained everything well enough. I hope that if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me, and we'll get your questions answered. So that wraps up for this week. I will see you next week, and I believe we're talking about campaigns and elections, which is definitely a fun topic for sure. So have a good week.